Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with executive coach and author Christian van Nieuwerburgh to discuss listening. Christian is a professor of coaching and positive psychology at the University of East London and executive director of Growth Coaching International, a Sydney-based global coach training provider for the education sector. He has authored numerous books, including An Introduction to Coaching Skills, a practical guide, From Surviving to Thriving, a student's guide to feeling and doing well at university, and Radical Listening, the Art of True Connection, co-authored with Robert Biswas-Diener, which was the topic of our conversation. One of the most meaningful takeaways from my conversation with Christian was the central role intention plays in becoming a better listener. When someone we care about approaches us with a problem, we often assume that listening well means tracking details and working toward a solution. But what if they aren't looking for answers at all? What if they simply want someone to sit with them in their frustration? In those moments, the most important information isn't found in the facts of the story, but in its emotional context, the fears, worries, and values beneath the surface. This distinction reshaped how I think about listening. Effective listening isn't about satisfying our instinct to fix or respond, but about aligning ourselves with what the other person truly needs. We need to listen for others, not for ourselves. Another insight that stood out was the reminder that not every interaction calls for the full use of our listening toolbox. Some conversations are meant for casual connection, venting, or coordinating action, and those moments may require less listening and more talking, and that's okay. As Christian points out, we don't need to use every tool all the time, only in situations where our goal is genuine connection. If you find yourself struggling to stay present in conversation or constantly planning what you'll say next, I encourage you to consider the perspectives Christian shares in this episode. They offer a powerful invitation to shift the focus outward and listen in a way that truly serves others. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Christian van Nieuwerburgh. Thank you so much for being on today.
Ryan, I'm just so excited to be here. I love talking about these things, so thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. I am also very curious about this type of content as well. So your book is called Radical Listening, The Art of True Connection. You co-authored it with Robert Biswas-Diener, and it is a practical guide to being a better listener. Now, there are other approaches to being a better listener that I've come across. I've been hearing the term active listening for quite some time as I've been in the behavioral sciences. Why don't we start by having you talk about what is unique about this radical listening approach that might be different from some of these traditional approaches to becoming a better listener?
Thanks, Ryan. That's exactly what this is about. The book is about how to be a better listener. And what we mean by better listener is somebody who's able to listen to other people in a way that makes them feel seen, valued, and heard. And yeah, I'm a big, avid reader of anything about listening. And you're right, there's been this active listening movement for a long time. And I'm a big fan of it. But ironically, it's not very active. We call it active listening, but it's quite passive. And my argument is active listening is really about the tools and techniques to look like you're listening. And we would say radical listening goes one step beyond that. And the subtitle of our book probably captures what this book is all about, and that's the art of true connection. So, in this book, we're thinking, what if listening were not just a communication tool? It's not just a way of communicating, but what if we use it as a way of really connecting with people and a basis for building relationships? So, uh, as we talk about this book and concept, I hope listeners will start to pick up what are some of the things that take this beyond active listening.
Hmm. When you discuss the topic of listening for the the lay person, what are some common misconceptions that you hear from them in terms of, just very broadly, something that a typical person may misconstrue about, the goals of conversation in general?
Yeah, these are very common ways of understanding it. So the idea of listening in order to respond, that comes up a lot, right? So that we often think the reason we listen is so that we can prepare a response to the other person. And so that's a typical way of understanding it. Whereas we're saying, wait a minute, listening can do more than that. It's not just listening to understand. And listen to understand is one of the seven habits of Stephen Covey, for example. But listening to understand is only part of it. We're saying, actually, there's ways to listen that show people that we value and appreciate them. The other thing, uh, I don't know if it's a misconception, but the common way of thinking about listening is when I'm listening, I should just go completely quiet. But again, we challenge that idea in this book that actually, if we want to listen in a way that shows people that we see them, we value them, and we appreciate them, that sometimes we don't just go quiet, that we have to interact with the other person. So, those are a few of the things that I think let's think some more about listening. And remember, Ryan, this is something almost all of us, everyone listening to this podcast, we do this every day. So imagine we could be 10% better at listening, or that we could use listening as a way of building connection and relationships.
Hmm. Uh, so you start in the book with introducing this idea of intention, which is, it seems to me to be the one of the first things that you have to be aware of when you enter into a conversation, because attention is a limited resource, and so if we're paying attention to one thing and not another, then it can cause friction potentially in a conversation. Um, when I thought about intention, I thought about another book that I've read recently called Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg. He kind of addresses this idea of intention as well, where, there's three types of conversations. There's what is this about? How do I feel? And who are we? It's like an identity, feelings, and facts kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
one of the things that I thought of. Um, so, what are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves at the beginning of a conversation to establish intention?
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And of course, there's this really important link, like you suggest, between intention and attention. So if, depending on what our intention is, we're going to pay attention to certain things in the conversation. So
Right.
that's one of the reasons being clear about our intention is helpful. But the other reason is just being more intentional about our interactions with others. So that's why thinking, imagine, I'm speaking to our listeners now, but imagine that you've got an interaction coming up with somebody. Now, that could be a colleague at work. It could be you're picking up a child from school. It could be that you're going to, interact with somebody who works in a particular location. The very act of just before we start the conversation, thinking, what is my intention towards this other person in this next interaction? I think that's already helpful because we're not just kind of going into autopilot and just having an interaction and seeing how it goes. It's actually we're taking care and attention to say, I'd like this interaction to be the best interaction it could be.
Right.
So that's the reasons for intention.
Hmm.
But to answer your question, what sort of things can we do? First, if I'm clear about my intention, let's say I'm going to pick up my son from school,
Hmm.
and my intention is we're going to have 20 minutes together in the car, for example. My intention is I would like my son to feel kind of appreciated and cared for. So my intention is I would like that to happen. So what sort of things can I do? One is maybe I'm already thinking about what are some opening questions I could ask. So for example, if it's picking up my son, did you have a good day at school? That's not a good question because it's probably going to be no or whatever. So
Right.
that's not a great question. The second is, what's the kind of energy I want to bring to this interaction? So we can plan for what kind of energy do I want to bring. So in the example I gave, I would have put on, as I'm driving to school, I would have put ABBA on. That's one of my favorite. I love listening to ABBA. It puts me in a good, positive mood. So I would listen to music. I might drink water, make sure I'm properly hydrated. So actually, some listeners might think, well, Christian's going way overboard here. But it's really about preparing for a positive interaction. And
Hmm.
the reason I'm using my son as an example is this is one of the most important relationships in my life. I want these interactions to go well. Now, of course, all of these strategies, we can use them in the workplace as well. We can use them with customers or clients we're working with.
Hmm.
It's all about taking time to plan for the interaction to go positively.
Yeah. As you were talking, it reminds me of how our default in these conversations tends to be more self-focused, right? So, how is school today? Like even there's a subtlety to asking the question of how was school today that is I want information. I want to know some things.
Yeah.
Even on the surface, I think questions that might be you might feel like you're trying to connect are more about you gathering information.
Yeah.
Sometimes, there's lots of these different what I would might call self-focus motives. Like I'm listening for entertainment. Sometimes when I'm out hanging out at a bar or something like that, and I strike up a conversation, like I'm really just listening for something entertaining, and I might get turned off if this conversation isn't entertaining for me.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about people have these motives of flexing their intellect. I find that the more I spend at home, working from home, when I get out with others, sometimes I just want to like share something I've learned with somebody.
Mhm.
Again, self focused. It's
Yeah.
not other focus. So could you talk a little bit about the role of thinking about yourself and the role of thinking about others, and that how that plays into this kind of dance of connection?
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful word, dance of connection. And Ryan, just a little aside to say, you're a great listener. You're demonstrating radical listening right now because you're bringing curiosity you're asking questions that allow me to talk about this. So this is an example of radical listening. So yeah, now the self and other, that's a really fascinating way to think about this. Um, and we do need to think about ourselves as well, but I'll come back to that. In terms of radical listening, the idea, you're right, is other focused, to think what's going to make this a positive interaction for the other person. So, another misconception is that the best way to connect with somebody, you talked about a bar, it's a good example. Let's say there's somebody you just want to connect with. It's typical that we think the best way to impress them or to connect with them is to tell them a lot about yourself. This is me, this is what I've done. So, to turn it on its head, actually, the best way to connect with someone is to be curious about them, to to be interested in them and to show them that you're interested. So, I like this idea of always go into kind of these positive interactions with thinking about what's going to make this interaction positive for the other person. And then by asking questions and being curious, even the questions, like you said, Ryan, in radical listening, we use questions slightly differently. As you suggested, in everyday interactions, the reason we use questions is often because we want some information. So I might ask you, hey, Ryan, where are you right now? That's for my benefit. I need to know that. Whereas in radical listening, we want to ask questions that show we're interested in the other person or that can invite them to say more about something that's of value to them. So that's one aspect of self and other. But the other way of thinking about it is we do also need to think about ourselves when we're trying to listen to people in a way that shows that we value them. And the reason I say that is you talked about attention already. The world we're in is really dividing our attention. A lot of things are drawing our attention towards them. And really, radical listening is the promise of, I'm going to give you undivided attention. So that's a really important part of it. So there is a good question about what do I need to do to make sure that I can be not distracted when talking to another person. So there's a lot of richness in this idea of self and other.
Let's stay on this idea of attention and being in the moment and engaging properly. You split the features of radical listening into internal activities versus external activities.
Yeah.
External is more the behavior, whereas internal is what's going on kind of in your head.
Yes.
And you talk about the importance of noticing
Mhm.
and this specifically relates to attention. Um, what is one of the most common features that people don't notice when they enter into a conversation?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And notice the reason we break these into three internal and three external skills is because in our book, we want to go beyond just saying, hey, we should listen better. We all know
Right.
that. We all want to do that. We've really tried to operationalize this into saying, look, you can work on each one of these six skills and improve them. So one of them is um, uh, quieting, and one of the internal skills is quieting. And in relation to our conversational partner, the person we're talking to, we want to create an environment where we can listen to them, where it's not too noisy and there's not too many distractions in the outside world. So we can notice whether the environment is conducive to a conversation where I give them my full attention. So I can notice it's a little bit loud here, or there's a lot going on. But the other interesting thing is to notice what's distracting me. So part of this skill
Hmm.
of quieting is to make sure that there's not things going on in my head that are getting in the way of giving my full attention. So I would say many of our listeners, they're probably good at noticing what's happening for the other person, noticing that they seem to be very quiet or very agitated or very active. So noticing what's going on for the other person is often what we're focusing on. The opportunity is to do a bit more noticing about what's going on for me right now. How ready am I to be fully present for the other? So, what are the kinds of things that can get in the way? Self talk. There can be some self talk that's going on in my mind that's distracting me. I'll give you an example. If I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I need to come up with a good next question, or I don't want them to think I'm stupid, or there's things that can happen in our own minds that actually are distracting us from paying full attention to the other. So, what I do, Ryan, when that happens, because I want to be really pragmatic and practical, if I ever notice that something that I'm saying to myself is getting in the way of me giving my full attention to the other person, I have a little mantra in my head, which is, I'll think about this later.
Hmm.
So if I'm starting to think, so this happens a lot in social events. Sometimes I go along to a social event as the plus one, right? My
Hmm.
partner knows a lot of people there, and I'm the plus one. I'm going along because I'm the partner. So I'm going in already thinking, well, who am I going to talk to? And I need to look clever. I need to look smart here. So I'll be talking to somebody else and they're saying something to me. And I'll be like, oh, I need to make a good impression. I need to make sure that I say something smart. I need to
Hmm.
make sure I'm interested. And that when that's going on in my head, ironically, I'm not fully present for the other person. So this idea of presence becomes so important, Ryan. How can I be grounded? How can I be fully present? How can I be open to hearing what the other person is saying? And if I notice anything internally, and even in my story, Ryan, the fact that I'm the plus one, that's already something going on that I need to address to say, you know what? I'm here. I'm going to enjoy being here. I'm going to connect with as many people as I would like. So that's an example of noticing. It's almost like noticing what's going on in me that might be getting in the way of being fully present to the other person.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so difficult. I mean, as somebody who has put effort into becoming a better listener over the course of the last, I don't know, let's just say 5 years or so, I find that stream of thoughts, it goes in so many directions, which I think is why it can be so distracting in conversation. Because it can be, as you said, I want to come off as competent to others.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
can be I want to come off as charming, right? All of these little motives that occupy our thoughts. And I agree. I like your idea of I'll think about it later.
Yeah.
Even as when I record podcast interviews, there are these moments where I need to what I tend to say to myself is to sink in and hyper focus on what they're saying, because what tends to happen is there's this fear that if I don't occupy some of my attention thinking about what I'm going to say next, I won't have anything to say. But if you actually practice just immersing yourself, and I guess it does take practice. That's perhaps that's why we need a book on listening rather than being able to pick this up on our own. But when you practice immersing yourself in listening to the words and maybe paying attention to feelings, the nonverbal things, that then it kind of opens itself up to a better flow in conversation.
You're absolutely right, Ryan. One of the things that I'm sure most of us will be terrified about, I don't really know why, is silences in conversations. In many Western cultures, we just hate silences. So here's an example. I've just met somebody for the first time. They're telling me something about what they're doing. If I'm worried about a silence, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to have something to say when they
Yeah.
finish talking. I need to prepare my answer. I need to come up with. The irony is, while I'm doing that, I've stopped listening. And exactly as you say, Ryan, if I'm actually in the conversation and it's going to flow naturally. When they finish what they're saying, something's going to come up that I'll be able to say. But ironically, worrying about, oh my gosh, I hope it doesn't get awkward, can
Hmm.
mean we're distracted. So radical listening is about listening to people in a way that they feel that we actually care about and value them. So yeah, I would say just any noticing anything that's getting in the way of us giving the other person our full attention.
So let's stay on this a little more because I have the suspicion that it's a little bit easier for me to manage my internal monologue, whereas others I think have a really hard time
Yeah,
managing this stream of consciousness. I was talking with somebody who was saying, it may be racing thoughts, but racing thoughts is one of the distractions that they have that keeps them from
yeah,
listening. But another is just boredom. People will flat out say like, I'm not interested in what is being said, and that is why I'm having a hard time
yeah,
listening. And you could obviously you could point to our shrinking attention span and how our devices kind of reward us with all of these short-term stimuli. But could you talk a little bit more about, practically speaking, somebody who is just having a really hard time
mm,
managing these internal thoughts? Are there any strategies that people can use to let's just say quiet the chatter?
yeah, exactly. And that's why we think quiet is a skill, the ability to quiet the chatter. And there's advantages to us if we can do this because it's a kind of making sure that we can manage the way that our mind works that's good for us and for other people. So it's great to practice these things. And if we can practice them in everyday conversations, how wonderful is that? So, what are some of the strategies for this? Let's talk about boredom as an example. One of my professional roles, Ryan, is as an executive coach. So, executive coaches, the business is to listen to people. So, I had this concern as well. I was thinking, oh my goodness, what if my client, is talking about something that's super boring for me? And there are some things, I'm not going to share them now because I don't want to offend anyone. But there are certain topics where I'm like, this isn't really a particular topic that's of interest to me. And so I've developed a strategy. So when the topic itself is not kind of really drawing me in, I turn my attention to the person. So, I'm
Mm.
coaching someone, they're talking about a particular work-related thing. Maybe I don't know a lot about it or it's not of great interest to me. I turn my attention to the person. And the really helpful thing is curiosity. And Ryan, I know you're a very curious person, so you have an advantage. But again, it's something that we as human beings, it's curiosity is natural to us, so we can reconnect with that. So let's say you're listening to someone and the topic is not interesting. I would dial up our curiosity and say, oh, I'm curious about this person. how are they managing this thing? What's their attitude to it? And so curiosity is another thing. Now, you talked about hyper focus as well, Ryan, and I like that phrase. So in radical listening, it's okay to interject. It's okay to jump in with something
Hmm.
while you're listening to the other person. So if you feel, you're getting disconnected from what's happening, I would interject. I'd jump in with something just to show the other person I'm with you, but also to make it engaging for me. Because radical listening is not about looking like we're interested. Radical listening is actually demonstrating that we're interested. And
Hmm.
one way to do that, especially if I'm easily distracted as well, by the way, Ryan. That's one of my things is I get easily distracted. So I like to really, really pay attention to one thing and then ask questions about that and jump in. But by doing that, we're actually showing the other person we're enthusiastic, we're interested. And this is a misconception of mine. I think we mentioned it earlier. I used to think the best way to listen to people is just go completely quiet for the whole time they're talking. But now, having written this book, I realize that could cause the person I'm talking to doubt, is Christian actually interested in what I'm saying? Because I've just
Right.
gone quiet the whole time.
Hmm.
Jumping in with these short, they're called minimal encouragers, tiny little things we jump in, say, oh, wow, or that's interesting, or tell me more about that. Those little interjections actually keep me engaged, but show my conversational partner that I'm all in, I'm right with them.
I like what you said about shifting from the topic to the person. I've never
Yeah,
really thought about it that way because if if you are bored with a topic, you're probably there are still things that you're curious about that don't deviate too far from what's happening. If somebody's talking
yeah,
about commodities or something,
yeah,
selling commodities or something like that, and uh, you can just take a beat and go, have you all what drew you into this? Why
yeah,
does this is this a passion of yours or is it just a job, right?
yeah.
Like these are there's always fertile ground for something to keep the conversation moving. But that's really interesting that you said I've never really thought of it that way.
Yeah. And Ryan, like hobbies, exactly. There's some hobbies, and again, I don't want to pick any because I don't want to offend anyone, but there's some hobbies that people talk to me about where that's not my hobby. And I'm like, I wouldn't do that hobby.
Right.
But exactly right. What is it about this that you love? Tell me more about that. And when do you do it? When did you start doing it? Oh, I actually I can remember a conversation just like this where I was thinking I'd never do that hobby, but I did say, what got you into it? What are the things that are most exciting? And honestly, Ryan, by the end of the conversation,
Mm.
I thought, I might get into this thing because one of the things that we talk about is intellectual humility or openness, and that's really big. That's really big. So intellectual humility is my view isn't correct, right? My view is not necessarily correct. My perspective is not necessarily the right one. And this openness to new ideas. So one of the big barriers is me thinking, oh, I'll never get into that. So if we can be open and curious
Hmm.
and radical listening, remember the subtitle is The Art of True Connection. So we're not suggesting people should be listening radically all the time. But if the relationship's important to you, if you're trying to connect with someone, then radical listening is the way to do it. So we're not saying radical listening is for all time. So if I'm just bumping into somebody casually and they're talking about something that I'm not that interested in, or they're saying something to me that I disagree with, it's okay for me to not be that invested. But the point is, if you're trying to connect with someone or the relationship is important, you do need to invest in that by providing the kind of listening we're talking about.
I think that's a helpful insight because I suspect to many people who might be invested in learning about how to listen better that they might conclude that, oh, it's a lot of work to do this in every conversation. And it sounds like what you're saying is no, you don't have to apply this. This is sort of the best way to do it when connection is a priority. And of
Yeah.
course, there there are lots of situations where a lesser strategy might be helpful because it's just you don't have the time to commit, for example, or maybe you can't get past the motivation that someone has done something morally reprehensible, and you just want to just get something out of your system, and so that I think that's helpful to somebody who's trying to go down this path of learning how to be a better listener.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to talk a little bit about the role of acceptance and how that can
No.
in how not accepting certain premises that might arise in conversation can be a hindrance to effective communication.
Mm,
And it's this idea that you talk about, which is acknowledging something about a conversation, someone's point of view, the situation itself, their limitations, without trying to make immediate changes. And as I was reading this part, it reminded me of a moment when I was hanging out with some friends in grad school, and someone said, uh, this is a fairly liberal group of people. It was a psychology program, and there were some people there, and someone who wasn't in the program said something to the effect of, "I'm not for gay marriage." Right? This is
mm,
20 years ago now, and immediately the first reaction from a couple people in the group were to shut that conversation, shut it down, say, "How could you do this? Why is this?
mm.
Why is this?" And I'll never forget this moment because I was so disappointed that people were trying to close that door and shut the conversation down, add shame, try to shame the person's way into believing something more liberal or progressive. And that incident relates a lot to this section in the book about acceptance, where one of the barriers to having an effective conversation and listening is to get past some of these statements so that you can learn more and focus on curiosity. Could you talk a little bit about acceptance and how it might differ from agreement?
Right. Yeah. It's such an important point you make. It's so important, and especially now, right? I think our listeners will recognize that now seems to be a time of great division and of people not listening to one another. So I'll be very honest with you, Ryan. Robert and I, when we were writing the book, we were thinking about one-to-one conversations between people, maybe family members, colleagues. But my big hope is that some of these ideas will be helpful at a kind of societal level. And you've given such a great example. The the radical listening gives the promise of starting to build connection. Whereas in the example you gave, there's no connection there. Somebody said something, it's been shut down. That's the end of it. There's no opportunity to keep the door open for dialogue. So that shuts dialogue down when one person says, well, that view is not correct. You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to think it. That kind of shuts things down. Whereas, and Robert, who I wrote the book with, is a great friend, colleague, and mentor. He uses the term foreclose a lot. He uses foreclosing. And he says we shouldn't foreclose. And shutting things down does that. But there is a big difference between accepting and agreeing. And what we mean in this book, one of the accepting is one of the skills. It's accepting the right of another person to hold a view that's different to our own. That's all that we're talking about. And it's accepting, okay, that's a view that you have. And it's being open enough to say, well, tell me a little bit more about that view. You could even say, I don't agree with your position, but I'm open to hearing. How did you come to this view? What is it? What's informing it? What's important to you about that view? It's possible for us to have that dialogue. And so it's accepting the right of the other person to have it. And my naive hope is that if I bump into someone who has a very different worldview or different perspective on a contentious topic, my hope is that if I say, look, tell me more about that view, I want to understand how you've come to it. My naive view is they might be just that little bit more open to want the same from me, to say, well, Christian, you've said you've got a very different view. What is your view? And so this is the idea of if we want to connect with people, we have to offer them the minimum respect of saying, you have a right to your perspective, just like I have a right to mine. And I'm open to hearing your perspective, but it does not mean that I agree with it or endorse it. And I think there is a big difference there. Whereas if we say to people, and this comes to this intellectual humility, I think one of the biggest risk factors to radical listening is a strong belief that I'm right.
Mm.
So I think that's where it makes dialogue very difficult for people is if I think my perspective, my opinion is the correct opinion, then of course I'm less open to hearing others. But if I can say, I have views, I have perspectives, I have opinions, and I hold these to be true. This is my view at the moment. This is what I believe. You can have that and also be open to other people having similar views, opinions that they've formed over many years within their societal context, within their group of people. So for me, Ryan, this is such an important thing um, that my invitation to our listeners is just to be that little bit more open to hearing what other people are thinking, what their views are. And I'm not suggesting we have to agree with them or endorse them. So that's the big difference.
Yeah, and it speaks to uh, going back to intention and motives, that sometimes we have these what you would call antisocial motives that you talk about in the book.
Yeah.
And I remember in my early 20s, I was all about the motive of I want to listen so that I can undermine this logical argument, something I disagree with. So
Yeah.
listening to undermine is kind of one of these antisocial motives. And you know, there's an emotional piece where it feels good to undermine someone's logic and make a strong argument. But as I've gotten older, I think I've completely abandoned this motive in favor of truly listening. And it's tough because I even sometimes when I feel like someone is trying to listen better with me, sometimes it feels like the questions are implying that they're not really curious, that there's still something that they're trying to undermine in the conversation. So it seems to be really challenging to to navigate these different motives, like the anti-social versus the more pro-social motives.
Yeah. And this is another one of the things for us to notice. That's all of us, just to kind of be aware of what is my motive here. What's the reason that I'm having this conversation? Uh, how am I listening to this person? And am I listening in a way that makes them doubt themselves? We can do that. Sometimes we do that. And one of the things I do, I'm an academic, and I have to admit, a lot of the listening I was trained to do as an academic is, I would say, undermining. So I would go to these papers, somebody's come to present a paper on their latest research, and I'd be sitting there listening the whole time for, oh, no, no, I don't agree with that, or you've got the date wrong here. So this idea of listening in a way that makes the other person feel valued, that's such a different way of listening. So if I if I could have gone back, I would often these people were visiting scholars or they were academics from different institutions. I wish I'd known then about actually listening in a way that values people. So it's actually noticing what is my motive. And in radical listening, there should be no manipulation. We're not trying to get them to think in a particular way. We're not trying to change the way they think about something. A way that you've got it right. If you're listening, if you're doing radical listening, the other person should be feeling energized and positive. They're good. They're like, oh my gosh, yeah, what I'm saying is making sense. Or this person is really interested in what I have to say. So that's how you can tell you're doing it right. And I'm going to be very honest with you, Ryan. With my own partner, as I was writing this book, I thought, I need to put this into practice. And one time we were going off for a drive, and I thought, I'm just going to listen in a way that shows I appreciate. One of the things I had to do is just stop talking, right? Often we're talking about something, and my partner says something, then I jump in, and I just stopped that. I thought, I'm going to completely I want to hear about what it's like for you. And embarrassingly, my partner said, Christian, is there something wrong with you today? Which just made me think, oh my gosh, I haven't been listening in the way that I like. And this might be something that happens. A lot of us in our workplaces, we put a lot of intention into listening and doing it right. But when we get home, are we still doing that? So my invitation to everyone is to make sure that we're applying these to the most important relationships in our lives as well as professional relationships or
Mhm.
friendship groups as well.
One of the aspects of radical listening that, in my opinion, might be one of the hardest to apply,
Okay.
and also the most important when your goal is a deeper connection, is acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Acknowledging what people are, acknowledging facts, acknowledging nonverbal information, acknowledging the feeling behind what people are saying. Reading between the lines, you might put it. Um, I This is something that I think I struggle with, and I'm sure you can sympathize with this. But what does it mean to acknowledge the other person at the start
Yeah.
of a conversation, to acknowledge the information that is being presented to you and some of the emotions that might be expressed?
Yeah, Ryan, you're right. And if our listeners, one thing I would say that it is challenging, and if you wanted to get started with it, I'm going to share a few techniques and tips that you can start using straight away. So imagine right at the beginning of the conversation, we can acknowledge that this conversation is going to be important. So ways of doing that is saying, this conversation is really important for me. So can we sit somewhere quiet? So you could say that. Another way is acknowledging the importance of the relationship or the conversation is to put away your mobile phone. This is a very important one, given how distracting it is. But I want to give it as an example of how you demonstrate and acknowledge. So if I sit down with somebody, let's say we're in a coffee shop, and I say, this conversation is really important, so let's sit somewhere quiet. And then I say, look, I want to give you my full attention, so I'm going to turn my phone off, or I'm going to put it on silent, or I'm going to put it away. These are actually acknowledging that this is an important conversation. So that's right at the start. You can be explicit to say, I want to really listen to you, or I want to make sure I give you my full attention. Other things to acknowledge is, like you suggested, emotions. So that's why we have to be good at noticing. So we're noticing, oh, this person seems really energized by this. So one way of acknowledging is to say, gosh, the way you're talking sounds like you're really energized. So we acknowledge an emotion. If somebody's gone through a tough time and they're saying, oh, it's really difficult at the moment, a short interjection to jump in and say, gosh, that sounds tough. You're acknowledging their experience to say, your experience sounds really tough. We can acknowledge people's strengths. So if somebody's very thoughtful, you can jump in and say, I can see you've thought a lot about this. Or if somebody's struggling because they want to do the right thing, you can acknowledge their strength of integrity. And I've done this recently, Ryan. I said to somebody, we were talking about something slightly different. I said, I just want to jump in to say, I really admire your integrity. It sounds like this is all about you trying to do the right thing. It just transformed the whole conversation because when we acknowledge a person's strengths, we're connecting, we're seeing something that's really connected to their values and their principles. So anytime you can acknowledge a strength, you're doing that. We can acknowledge non-verbally as well. So if somebody said something painful, I can look down for a minute or I can go very quiet. You don't even have to say something to acknowledge what's been happening. And then towards the end of the conversation, you can say things to acknowledge the person, to say something along the lines of, I really appreciated listening to you today, or it's great to get to know you in this way, or I really appreciate how honest you've been. So acknowledging is something I say we can always dial up. You might already be doing it, but just to experiment, try dialing it right up to see what's the impact of when you acknowledge the other person. Now, why is this working? Why does it work? Is because every time we acknowledge the other person, we're reassuring them. Because if the person's having doubts, like let's say I'm listening to someone and they're saying, well, is Christian judging me? Does Christian think this is silly? Does Christian appreciate me? All of those doubts are actually getting in the way of their thinking as well.
Yeah.
So every time we acknowledge the person, I hope that what we're doing is reassuring them. And when they're reassured, that allows them to think more broadly, think more laterally, because the being judged is something that we all fear at the moment. This is as big a fear as being chased by a tiger or a lion or something like that. Nowadays, none of us wants to feel judged. So, another big part of radical listening is listening to a person that's saying, look, I'm interested in you and I'm not judging you.
Hmm.
Now, if I'm listened to in that way, it makes me more open, it makes me feel better about myself. So, Ryan, there's another big reason for radical listening is I would say it's good for the well-being of the person you're listening to, and it's probably good for your well-being as the listener as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It took me a really long time to get to the point where I realized that 90% of conversations are just people wanting someone else to acknowledge that they're not crazy. Like
Yeah.
that their reality is consistent and someone else can validate and say, yeah,
Yes.
I would be
Yes.
angry too. I would be
Yes.
frustrated too. And it's interesting that I don't know why it took so long to have that sort of insight, but those were some really, really useful phrases. I'm glad you mentioned those. There's a lot more in the book. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to wrap up by on this topic. So uh, those are some very effective ways to acknowledge and
Yeah.
to address emotional content in a conversation. But that means that there are probably some other phrases or patterns that people use that they might think are constructive, but in reality, they may put up walls or they may create barriers to connection. One of my favorites that you brought up briefly in the book was a sentence like "everything will be just fine." So
Oh, yeah.
someone is sharing how a struggle at work, for example, or they're
Yeah.
thinking about a future event. And I am so guilty of this, of just not everything will be just fine. And I'm my first thought was, oh, they're coming to me for comfort. So
Yeah.
how do I comfort? Well, I will reassure them that everything will be just fine. And don't get me wrong, there are moments probably where this can be fit. It can be congruent with what I'm
Yeah.
being asked, but more often than not, everything will be just fine is actually incongruent with what the person is trying to get out of me in this conversation. To close, could you talk a little bit about some common ways that people might mistakenly think
Yeah.
are helping with connection, but in reality, it may have the opposite effect?
Yeah. Great point, Ryan. And yeah, everything's just going to be fine,
Hmm.
or don't worry about it. That's
Yeah,
another phrase. I would
yeah,
say let's be cautious with those because, or don't be angry.
sure.
Somebody comes to you, they're angry, and you're trying to reassure them, oh, don't be angry. But it's actually not possible. If
Right.
somebody's experiencing anger, just telling them don't be angry or don't be anxious or don't be
Yeah.
stressed, that actually doesn't work. So, step one is, like you said, to acknowledge. Oh, I can see why you're feeling that way. And another great word, Ryan, for this is normalizing.
Right.
One of the things we can do to support others is to normalize because when something's happening to me, I'm thinking it's only me, everybody else is fine, I'm the only one. But if you say, oh, yeah, I can understand why you think that, or I know so many people who have experienced that same thing, I think that's more helpful. So it's actually unhelpful to say without giving any evidence that things are going to be all right because it might come across to the person that you haven't heard them because they've just told you, I'm worried about this.
Yeah.
I haven't been sleeping well. And you're like, oh, don't worry, it's going to be fine. They haven't been acknowledged. Their concerns haven't been recognized. So, one is to recognize it, because this does sound fine. You're right, Ryan. There are some situations where saying that things are going to work out will be helpful, but I would add evidence to that. So I would say something like, knowing you and the way that you work, and having seen your successes in the past, I'm optimistic. From my perspective, I think, yeah, it's probably going to go well. You want to give some evidence alongside any commentary about things working out. Another common one that can actually get in the way is saying to a person, I know exactly what that's like. Right.
Mhm.
And again, our intention is probably to connect or to
Yeah.
reassure. But if I'm talking about something and my conversational partner says, I know exactly what that's like, it makes me think, well, I don't need to say it then. So a way of rephrasing, I know exactly what that's like, is, oh, I've been in similar situations to that, or I did something similar. What's it like for you? In
Right.
radical listening, we want to keep the focus on the person who's talking. It's almost like in radical listening, it should feel like it's always their turn to talk. So if I want to jump in and say, oh, yeah, I went to Japan too, I don't want to say, so I know exactly what it's like, because then they have no reason to tell me. I'd say something like, I went to Japan about 10 years ago. What was it like for you? I've
Right.
managed to convey we've got something in common, but I haven't taken over the conversation. So, another few phrases that I think, let's just think about is um, something like, don't get me wrong, right? Because the moment you say something like, don't get me wrong, whatever you're going to say after that, probably don't do it. Or I'm not being funny, but so actually thinking about our what it is we say in these conversations is really important. And I guess the rule of thumb is what's going to be the most helpful thing I can say so that the other person feels appreciated, acknowledged, and valued. I just want to say one last thing, which maybe is a big one. I just want to share this before we wrap up.
Hmm.
And it's about optimal matching. And in fact, there was some research in the 1980s and 90s about matching. This is to make sure that when we're listening to someone, we're listening to them in a way that matches what it is they're hoping for from the conversation. So I'm going to use another home example. Imagine uh, a friend, a partner, a child, a parent comes home at the end of the day
Hmm.
and they just want to talk about something. We really have to make sure that we're listening in a way that matches what it is they would like. Sometimes people just want to vent. People just want to come and say, I've had a tough day at work. It's been really difficult, or tough day at school. And so we really need to make sure we're listening in a way that matches what it is that's wanted. And we can do this through noticing, we can do it through really being perceptive. But I think there's a shortcut. And the shortcut is to say, how would you like me to listen to you? Just to be really upfront and explicit, would you like me to listen to you in a way that's helping you to solve something? Would you like me to listen to you in a way that you feel validated? Do you just want me to listen with empathy? So I like this idea of if you're trying to listen to somebody in a way that makes them feel better and valued and appreciated, what about sometimes jumping in and checking in with that person? How would you like me to listen to you in this situation?
Hmm.
Can be a game changer as well.
Yeah. Again, the name of the book is Radical Listening: The Art of True Connection. If you think that we have summarized the book in its entirety, you would be wrong. There's a lot more in there that we did not get a chance to talk about. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Christian van Nieuwerburgh.
Thank you so much. And I hope everybody's found something valuable. And I just want to say to our listeners, you're already listening, you know. And when we talk about motives, my hope is that your motive was to learn, right? So you're listening because you want to learn some practical things. And I just want to emphasize this idea that if learning was your intention, your attention was probably drawn to what am I already doing? What can I do differently? What are some practical tips? So I just want to come back to this idea of in your further interactions when you're listening, just to start with being clear, what's my intention here?
For more on Christian, follow him on Instagram at Coach on a Motorcycle, or pick up a copy of Radical Listening: The Art of True Connection wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowedo that podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast or on X at WDWDTPod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?